The sun was just starting to rise when I decided to go for a hike. It was one of those mornings where the air felt fresh and crisp, and the world hadn't yet come alive with the hustle of the day. The trails were mostly quiet at this hour, a perfect time for me to escape the noise of the world and enjoy the solitude of nature. I packed my bag with a couple of water bottles, some snacks, a first aid kit, and my camera. I wasn't planning on anything too intense, just a nice, relaxing walk in the woods. The trailhead was just a short drive away, nestled on the edge of the national park. I'd hiked here a few times before, so I knew the area pretty well. Nothing unusual ever happened on these hikes. It was just a way for me to get some exercise and clear my head. I parked the car in the small lot at the trailhead. There were no other vehicles there, which was exactly how I liked it. I grabbed my bag and started walking down the path. The dirt trail was soft beneath my boots, the ground still damp from the morning dew. Tall trees towered above me, their branches stretching out like arms reaching for the sky. A few birds chirped in the distance, and a gentle breeze rustled through the leaves. It was peaceful, serene. I followed the trail as it wound deeper into the forest. The trees grew thicker as I went, their trunks rising up in towering columns. The path began to narrow, becoming a bit more rugged as it snaked around boulders and through patches of tall grass. The occasional sound of a squirrel scampering up a tree or the rustle of leaves underfoot broke the silence. But for the most part, I was alone with my thoughts. As the morning wore on, the sun slowly climbed higher in the sky. The air warmed, and the forest seemed to come to life. The path had become a bit steeper, and the terrain was getting rougher. I didn't mind though. I was used to hiking, and the challenge of navigating over roots and rocks made the journey more interesting. I wasn't following any specific trail today, just exploring the area, trying to see new parts of the woods I hadn't ventured into before. As I walked, I came across a narrow stream cutting through the woods. The water was clear and cold, running swiftly over smooth stones. I stopped for a moment, crouching down to get a closer look. The sound of the flowing water was soothing, and I could hear the soft splash of fish darting through the current. After taking a quick drink from my water bottle, I continued on. The path was starting to fade a little, the way becoming less defined. The trees were denser here, and the forest floor was more uneven. I hadn't seen any other hikers since I first set off, and the sense of isolation was starting to settle in. I hadn't thought much about it at first, but now that the trail was getting rougher, I realized I was pretty far from the main path. There were no signs, no markers, just trees and dirt and rock. I wasn't lost, but the thought did cross my mind. The trail had all but disappeared, and the trees were so dense in some spots that they seemed to block out the sky. I paused for a moment, trying to get my bearings. I could hear the distant sound of the stream, but I wasn't sure which direction it was coming from anymore. I could go back the way I came, but something told me to keep going. There was a feeling of discovery in the air, like there was something waiting for me if I just kept moving forward. So I did. The further I went, the quieter it became. The birds had stopped singing, and even the wind seemed to die down. The only sounds were the crunch of the leaves underfoot and the occasional snap of a twig. It felt like I was the only one left in the world. After another half hour of trekking, I came to a clearing. It wasn't much of a clearing, more like a small open area surrounded by thick brush and trees. In the middle of it was a large boulder, its surface covered in moss and lichen. It looked like a good spot to rest, so I dropped my bag beside the rock and sat down. I was feeling the first signs of fatigue by then, so I took a long drink from my water bottle and pulled out a granola bar. As I sat there, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. It wasn't anything I could put my finger on, but there was a strange tension in the air, a sense of being watched. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I glanced around the clearing. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary, but my unease only grew. I tried to push the feeling aside and focused on finishing my snack, but the quiet seemed too thick, too suffocating. I stood up, deciding it was time to move on. As I was about to leave, I noticed something odd on the ground near the edge of the clearing. It looked like a piece of cloth, dark and torn, just barely visible under a pile of leaves. My curiosity got the better of me, so I bent down to examine it. It was a small piece of fabric, frayed and worn, but I couldn't tell what it was. I brushed away the leaves to get a better look, and that's when I saw it. Tucked underneath the cloth, there was something shiny. I reached down and pulled it out. It was a small metal object, half buried in the dirt. I rubbed it clean, and what I saw made my heart skip a beat. It was a pocket knife. Not just any pocket knife, though. This one was old, really old. The blade was rusted, and the handle was worn smooth from years of use. It didn't look like something someone would leave behind by accident. It looked intentional. I stood up, my mind racing. What was this knife doing out here? It didn't make sense. There was no sign of any other hikers in the area, and the trail was barely visible. Who would leave something like this behind in the middle of nowhere? A feeling of dread settled over me. The woods felt different now, darker, more foreboding. I looked around again, but the trees stood silent, unmoving. I shoved the knife into my pocket, hoping that maybe I was just overthinking things, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I decided to head back, but this time, I moved quickly. I retraced my steps as best as I could, trying to find the main trail again. The path was even harder to follow now, and I was starting to get frustrated. Felt like I'd walked in circles. The trees all looked the same, and every direction seemed to lead me further away from the way I came. I checked my watch, but I had no idea how long I had been walking. Felt like hours. That's when I heard it. A sound, far off in the distance, but distinct enough to make my heart race. A snap. It was a twig breaking, the kind of sound you hear when someone is walking through the forest. Someone was out there. I froze, straining my ears to listen. The sound came again, closer this time. I couldn't see anything through the dense trees, but I knew someone was there, watching. My pulse quickened, and I tried to steady my breath. I knew I had to stay calm, but the fear was gnawing at me. I turned around and started walking faster, my eyes scanning the woods around me. The feeling of being watched grew stronger. The forest seemed to close in around me, the trees blocking out the sky. Every step felt heavier, as though the ground itself was pulling me down. I wasn't sure if I was still on the trail, but I didn't care. I just needed to get out of there. The sound came again, closer now. A snap, followed by the crunch of leaves. Whoever it was following me. I broke into a run. My breath came in quick, shallow gasps as I pushed through the underbrush, not caring about the branches that scratched at my skin or the rocks that tripped me up. I just needed to get back to the trail, to get back to the car. I don't know how long I ran, but eventually, I broke through the trees and found myself back on the main trail. The path was familiar, and I could see the trailhead in the distance. I didn't stop running until I was safely back at my car, my hands trembling as I fumbled for the keys. I slammed the door shut behind me and locked it, my heart still racing. I sat there for a long time trying to calm down, but the feeling of dread lingered. There was no logical explanation for what had happened out there. No signs of anyone else, no footprints, no reason why someone would be following me in the first place. But whatever it was, I knew I wasn't going back there again. As I pulled out of the parking lot and drove away, the woods seemed to retreat into the distance, becoming nothing more than a dark memory. But even now, when I think back on that day, I still feel the weight of it. The woods have a way of keeping their secrets, and I don't plan on trying to uncover them again. It was a Saturday morning when I set out on what I thought would be a peaceful solo hike. The air was crisp, the sun barely rising above the treetops, casting long, soft shadows on the forest floor. I had chosen a trail that I'd heard was moderately challenging but not too strenuous, perfect for a day of quiet reflection in the wilderness. The sort of hike where you could walk for hours without anyone else around, just you and the wilderness. I'd packed the essentials: water, snacks, a first aid kit, my map, and a trusty pocket knife. Nothing too extravagant, just enough to get me through the day. The trailhead was quiet, and aside from a few birds singing overhead, the only sound was the crunch of leaves under my boots as I started off into the woods. The path was narrow at first, winding between trees, some towering and ancient looking, while others seemed younger, their trunks still thin and smooth. The air smelled of damp earth and pine, a scent that filled my lungs and gave me a sense of calm. For the first hour, everything was exactly as I expected. I moved at a steady pace, occasionally pausing to take in the view, snapping a few photos, and feeling the peacefulness of being so far from the noise of the world. The path grew steeper as I ascended, the trees around me getting thicker, casting more shadow on the trail. At one point, I came to a small creek that ran across the path, its water clear and gurgling softly over the rocks. I stepped carefully across the stones, feeling a cool mist rise off the water as I continued. The farther I went, the more isolated I felt. I had seen no one on the trail so far, not even a hiker. At first, I found it comforting, but after a while, a strange sense of unease began creeping into my thoughts. The forest around me was so quiet, so still. It was as though the whole world had fallen asleep, and I was the only one still awake. My footsteps echoed off the trees, a constant reminder that I was alone. I had been hiking for nearly 2 hours when I realized that the trail had started to fade. What had been a well-maintained path now seemed more like a vague suggestion of a trail, overgrown with thick underbrush and scattered with rocks and fallen branches. I stopped for a moment to check my map, but the trail was still supposed to continue up the mountain. My instincts told me to turn back, but there was a small part of me that wanted to push forward. I'd come this far, and turning back now felt like giving up on something. Besides, there was no harm in continuing a little longer. I pressed on, but the trail became more and more difficult to follow. The trees were denser here, their branches reaching out like claws, brushing against my face and arms. The sunlight barely filtered through the thick canopy above, casting the forest floor in a gloomy, dim light. The trail twisted and turned, and I started to feel a bit disoriented, but I figured I could always retrace my steps if things got too confusing. It was just a short hike after all. But then the strange feeling grew stronger. It wasn't just that I was alone. It was something else. A prickling sensation crawled up the back of my neck, and I couldn't shake the sense that something was watching me. It was a vague, unsettling feeling, something I couldn't quite put my finger on, but it made my heart rate quicken, and I couldn't help but glance over my shoulder every few moments, half expecting to see someone there. But there was no one. I tried to shake the feeling off, telling myself that it was just my imagination. After all, I was alone in the woods, and silence can play tricks on the mind. But then I noticed something odd. There were no animal sounds, no birds, no squirrels, no rustling in the underbrush. The forest had gone eerily silent. Even the wind had stopped, and it was as if the entire forest had held its breath. That's when I heard it. A rustling sound, faint at first, but distinct, came from just off the trail to my left. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The sound was too deliberate to be an animal, too controlled. It sounded like someone, or something, moving through the underbrush, carefully and quietly. I stood there for a long moment, my heart thudding in my chest, listening. Came again, closer this time. I glanced around, my eyes scanning the trees and the shadows, but I saw nothing. No movement, no figures. My mind raced, trying to rationalize what I'd heard. Could be another hiker, I thought. Maybe someone was just a little further ahead on the trail. But as I waited, the sounds didn't come again. The forest was silent once more. Shaking my head, I continued on, my mind still replaying the strange noise. I couldn't tell if I was just being paranoid or if there was something really out of place. The trail began to curve sharply around a bend, and I felt a strange sense of urgency building in me, as if I needed to get to the top as quickly as possible. It didn't make sense. I wasn't normally this anxious, but the longer I walked, the more I felt like I was being pulled deeper into something I didn't fully understand. I rounded the bend, and then the trail opened up into a small clearing. The sun was higher now, though it still struggled to break through the canopy above. I stepped into the clearing and stopped in my tracks. In the center of the clearing was a large rock formation, a cluster of jagged boulders rising from the earth like the bones of some ancient creature. It was an odd sight, and for a moment, I stood there staring at it, a sense of unease crawling up my spine, and that's when I saw it. There, just beyond the rocks, a faint shape, a figure standing still, staring at me from the shadows. My heart skipped a beat, and my blood ran cold. It wasn't a hiker, I realized. It was too still, too silent. I couldn't make out any details of the figure, just the vague outline of a person, or what I assumed was a person, dressed in dark clothes, almost blending into the shadows of the trees behind them. I didn't know how long I'd been standing there, frozen, but I knew I couldn't stay there any longer. I slowly began to back away, my breath coming in shallow, quick bursts. But the figure didn't move. I kept my eyes locked on it as I took another step back, and then another. My mind was racing, my body trembling with fear, but I couldn't look away. The longer I stared, the more I felt this growing sense of wrongness. I didn't know who or what it was, but I knew I needed to get out of there. I turned and began walking quickly, my pace picking up until I was nearly running, trying to put distance between myself and the figure in the clearing. The path had become a blur, and my heart was pounding so loudly I could hardly hear anything else. I didn't dare look back. I don't know how long I ran. Minutes? Hours? The forest seemed to stretch on endlessly, the path twisting and turning in every direction. I kept running, though my legs felt like lead, and my lungs burned with each breath. My only thought was to get back to the trailhead, to get back to safety. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I stumbled out of the woods, the trailhead coming into view. The sunlight seemed brighter now, almost blinding after the dark, oppressive woods. I stopped for a moment, gasping for air, my legs shaking beneath me. I didn't stop to look back, but I felt the tension in my chest start to ease. I made my way back to the parking lot where my car was waiting, still feeling that unease crawling over me, but it was fading. Slowly, as I climbed into the car and started the engine, I realized something. Whatever had been in the forest, whatever had made that noise, it was gone. The silence had returned. It was just me, the road, and the quiet hum of the car's engine. I had made it out of there. As I drove home, the sense of dread that had clung to me started to unravel. I'd never been so scared in my life, but I was alive. I was safe, and sometimes that was enough. The forest was quiet as I set off on my hike, the trail stretching ahead like a path through the unknown. I had always enjoyed hiking, finding solace in the rhythm of my steps and the stillness of the world around me. Today, however, felt different. Maybe it was because I had decided to take a trail less traveled, one that I had found on an old map tucked away in my backpack. There was no indication of how long it would take or what I would encounter, but that was part of the appeal. I was looking for an adventure, something that would shake me out of my daily routine. Little did I know, the adventure I was about to have would be far beyond what I had imagined. The day had started crisp, the morning sunlight filtering through the canopy above, casting dappled patterns on the forest floor. I breathed in deeply, the fresh scent of pine and earth filling my lungs. The air was cool, perfect for a hike, but I knew the heat would come later as the sun climbed higher in the sky. The path was narrow and winding, flanked by towering trees that seemed to stretch on forever. There was no sign of anyone else. This part of the forest felt untouched, as if the world had forgotten about it. I carried only a small backpack with the essentials: water, a couple of granola bars, a map, and my phone. Though I wasn't sure how much service I'd get out here. The trail twisted and turned, climbing steadily as I ventured deeper into the woods. The sound of my boots crunching on the dirt was the only noise breaking the silence, save for the occasional rustling of leaves in the breeze. After about an hour, I came across something strange. A small clearing that wasn't on the map. I stopped for a moment, surveying the area. The trees formed a natural circle around the space, their trunks thick and gnarled, the ground covered in a blanket of moss. There were no signs of wildlife, no birds chirping or animals scurrying. Felt too quiet, unnaturally so. A shiver ran down my spine, but I brushed it off, reminding myself that it was just the stillness of the forest. I decided to push on, figuring that I was just being paranoid. But as I continued walking, the feeling of being watched grew stronger. It wasn't something I could explain, just an unease that I couldn't shake. I glanced over my shoulder a few times, half expecting to see someone standing behind me, but no one was there. The trail began to climb more steeply now, and the trees grew thicker, their branches weaving together to form a dense canopy. The sunlight had faded as I ascended, and the air felt cooler, damp even. I took a sip of water, wiping the sweat from my forehead. My legs were starting to feel the strain, but I kept going, determined to reach the top. Hours passed, and I had lost track of time. The once gentle incline had turned into a steep, grueling climb. My muscles ached, and I could feel my heart pounding in my chest as I pushed forward. The forest around me was changing. The trees were no longer just tall and thin. They had become twisted, their bark scarred and gnarled, as though they had endured some great hardship. There was a heaviness to the air now, as though something was pressing down on the world. At one point, I stumbled upon an old, weathered trail marker, more of a signpost really, overgrown with ivy and moss. It was barely visible against the backdrop of the forest, but I could just make out the faint letters etched into the wood. They didn't match the markers I had seen earlier on the map. This was something older, something abandoned. I felt my stomach tighten as a sudden realization hit me. I was far off course. I tried to retrace my steps, but the trail was no longer clear. The path seemed to have disappeared entirely, swallowed up by the dense underbrush. The trees now seemed to close in on me, their branches reaching out like arms trying to pull me deeper into the forest. I felt a pang of panic but forced myself to remain calm. I couldn't afford to lose my cool. I checked my map, but it was of no use. The map didn't match the terrain I was seeing around me. I could feel the first flicker of fear in my chest, but I shoved it down, telling myself that I just needed to find my bearings and stay focused. The sky had begun to darken as the sun dipped behind the treetops. I wasn't sure how much time had passed, but I knew I needed to find shelter for the night. I couldn't keep going in circles, and I had no idea how far I had strayed off the path. My phone had no signal and the battery was running low. I had no choice but to stop and figure something out. I came across a small ravine, the sound of running water echoing through the trees. It seemed like a good place to rest, so I decided to set up camp for the night. The sun was nearly gone, and the temperature was dropping quickly. I found a flat spot near the edge of the ravine, just off the main path, and set up my tent. The process felt almost mechanical. Pitch the tent, lay out my sleeping bag, start a small fire. My mind was racing, but I kept myself busy, needing to feel some semblance of control. As the fire crackled, I sat by it, staring into the flames. The forest around me seemed to come alive as night fell. The usual sounds of nature were muted, replaced by an eerie quiet. The wind rustled through the leaves, but there was something unnatural about it. It almost felt like the forest was holding its breath. I lay in my tent that night, unable to sleep. The feeling of being watched returned, but now it was more pronounced, more urgent. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig, made my heart race. I told myself it was just the forest, just the normal sounds of the woods at night. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, something that didn't belong. I pulled the covers over my head and tried to shut out the noise, but sleep wouldn't come. The next morning, I woke up to find the forest shrouded in mist. The air was thick with moisture, and the ground was slick with dew. I packed up my camp as quickly as I could, eager to leave the uneasy feeling behind. But as I made my way back to the ravine's edge, I realized something strange. The trail that had been there the night before was gone. The area where I had set up camp had changed. I stood there, confused, scanning the forest around me. There was no sign of the trail leading back the way I had come. It was as if the forest had swallowed it up. Panic surged through me as I realized I was even further lost than I had thought. The forest had a way of distorting time and space, making it impossible to find my bearings. I didn't know where I was, and I didn't know how to get back. Hours passed, and I wandered aimlessly through the dense woods. The mist had burned off, but the forest seemed to grow darker, more oppressive with each step. The trees loomed like silent sentinels, their twisted forms casting long, sinister shadows across the path. My legs were sore, and I was running low on water and food. I felt the weight of exhaustion in every step, but I couldn't stop. I couldn't afford to. As the day wore on, the situation grew more desperate. My phone had died completely, and the map was no help anymore. I was running on pure instinct now, stumbling through the woods, hoping to find anything that would lead me back to civilization. But all I could see were the trees, stretching out in every direction, offering no answers. Just as the sun began to set once more, I saw something in the distance, movement. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. At first, I thought it was a person, but as I got closer, I realized it was a small clearing, a break in the trees. My mind raced, wondering if this was some kind of trick, but I pushed forward, desperate for any sign of safety. When I reached the clearing, I couldn't believe my eyes. There, in the center of the space, was a small cabin. It was old, the wood weathered and worn, but it was a shelter, a real, solid structure in the middle of this endless forest. My heart leaped in my chest as I rushed toward it, my exhaustion forgotten for the moment. I knocked on the door, not caring if anyone was inside. I needed help. The door creaked open, revealing a man who looked as if he had been living in isolation for years. His eyes were wary, but he stepped aside and motioned for me to come in. I didn't hesitate. The inside of the cabin was sparse but functional. There was a fire crackling in the hearth, a few chairs around a small wooden table, and a single bed tucked in the corner. The man didn't say much, but I could tell he had been watching over the forest for a long time. He seemed to know exactly what had happened, and after a long silence, he handed me a map. It was different from the one I had, marked with trails and landmarks I hadn't seen before. "You took the wrong path," he said, his voice low. "This forest isn't like the others. It has a way of drawing people in and never letting them leave. You're lucky you found this place." I didn't ask him any more questions. I was too tired, too drained. He offered me food and water, and I took it gratefully, feeling my body begin to recover. As the night wore on, I fell asleep in the bed, the weight of the day's events still heavy in my mind. When I woke up the next morning, the man was gone, and the cabin was empty. But the forest seemed less menacing now. The trees The sun had just started to rise when I laced up my boots and checked my backpack. I'd been planning this hike for weeks, and the thought of getting out into the wilderness felt like freedom, a kind of relief. It was the kind of early morning where everything felt still, quiet, and fresh. The air had that crisp, cool bite to it, the kind of cool that promised the warmth of the day ahead. I'd chosen a trail a little off the beaten path, hoping to avoid the usual crowds that filled the more popular routes. The place I was heading to wasn't well known, and I'd heard it was beautiful, with long stretches of forest, jagged rock formations, and wide, sweeping views of the valley below. I liked the idea of being alone with nothing but the sounds of nature. It was just me, my backpack, and the trail. The first few miles were easy. The path was well marked, winding gently through thick trees that towered above me, their leaves just starting to turn, tinged with the first hints of fall. Birds chirped overhead, and every now and then, a squirrel darted across the trail, quick and curious. The sun filtered through the canopy, casting dappled patches of light on the ground. It was a perfect morning, the kind you don't get too often. As I continued, the trail began to get steeper, the dirt path narrowing as it wound deeper into the forest. The trees here were older, more dense. The air felt different now, heavier somehow, and the chirping of birds grew sparse. My footsteps echoed softly as I made my way up, the silence almost oppressive. Every now and then, I could hear a distant rustling in the underbrush, but I knew it was just wildlife, nothing to worry about. I stopped to take a swig of water, wiping the sweat from my forehead. My backpack felt a little heavier now, and my legs were starting to feel the strain of the climb. But the idea of reaching the top kept me going. I told myself it would be worth it. The higher I got, the more isolated it felt. The trees here were spaced farther apart, and the trail started to get rocky. I had to step carefully, watching my footing as I navigated the uneven ground. There were stretches of exposed stone that jutted out from the hillside, offering an occasional glimpse of the valley far below. But even those views were fleeting, blocked by the thick undergrowth that seemed to close in on the path. It was getting quieter as I ascended. The usual sounds of nature, the rustle of leaves, the calls of birds, seemed to fade. It was like the world was holding its breath. I tried not to think about it, but something in my gut told me to be cautious. It wasn't that the trail was dangerous, at least not in any obvious way, but there was something unsettling about the silence. A few hours in, I reached a point where the trail narrowed even further. The trees were packed so tightly that they almost seemed to lean in, their branches tangling overhead. The path had become more of a rough, uneven track, and I had to pay even more attention to my steps, carefully placing one foot in front of the other. My breath was heavy, the weight of my pack dragging on my shoulders. I paused for a moment, trying to take it all in, but all I could hear now was the pounding of my own heart. It was then that I noticed the signs. Little things at first. Branches snapped in strange directions, leaves disturbed as if something had passed through recently. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. I wasn't alone. I kept walking, but I was aware of the sounds around me now more so than before. I thought I heard something to my left, just beyond the trees, but when I turned to look, there was nothing. I tried to shake it off, telling myself that it was probably just an animal, maybe a deer or something else moving through the brush. But I couldn't get rid of the feeling, the nagging sensation that something wasn't quite right. A few more miles and the trail became less of a path and more of a suggestion. The trees were thicker now, the underbrush dense and hard to push through. I had to slow down, bending branches out of my way as I fought my way forward. The air was heavier here, more oppressive. It felt like the forest was swallowing me, and I started to feel trapped. My gut was telling me to turn back, but I pressed on, thinking about the view at the top. The idea of turning back now felt like giving up, and I wasn't going to do that. Not after all this effort. It was then that I saw it. Up ahead, the trail veered to the left, where it appeared to end abruptly at a large rock outcrop. I could see a clearing just beyond it, and the promise of the valley view I had been working toward for hours. But something about the outcrop bothered me. The rocks looked too smooth, too unnatural. As I got closer, I realized they weren't just rocks. They were stacked, carefully arranged. It was a cairn, a pile of rocks, but not a typical one. This one had an odd, deliberate pattern to it, like someone had been here recently and spent a lot of time putting it together. I stopped, staring at it. Something in my mind screamed at me to turn around, but I ignored it, stepping closer to inspect the pile. There was no sign of recent activity. No broken twigs, no fresh footprints. But the cairn felt wrong. It wasn't just a random pile. It looked like it had been constructed with intent, but why here? And who had built it? I stood there for a moment, studying it before I decided to push on. I couldn't explain why, but the pull of reaching the top was stronger than my unease. I walked around the cairn and headed toward the clearing. The moment I stepped out of the trees, I froze. The clearing wasn't a view like I had imagined. It wasn't a beautiful, expansive vista. Instead, it was a strange, empty space, like a scar in the forest. The ground was bare, the earth churned and disturbed. There were signs of something having been dragged through the area. Large, deep gouges in the earth, as if something heavy had been moved across it. My heart began to race, and I felt the hair on the back of my neck prickle again. And then I saw the markings. They were faint, almost indiscernible at first, but once I spotted them, they became impossible to ignore. Scratches on the trees. Not just any scratches, but long, deliberate gashes, deep enough that the bark had been torn away. They were spaced too evenly, too consistently to be from an animal. They looked intentional. I stepped back, my breath catching in my throat. I needed to leave now. But as I turned to head back down the trail, I heard it. A sound in the distance, sharp and distinct. The crack of a branch snapping, followed by the unmistakable sound of something moving through the underbrush. It wasn't an animal. It was too deliberate, too rhythmic. someone or something was out there. I picked up the pace, my heart pounding now, my legs moving faster than they had all day. The path back was harder to follow, the underbrush thicker, the rocks more treacherous. My thoughts were a blur. I had to get out. I had to get away. I stumbled several times, my feet catching on rocks and roots, but I didn't stop. Every instinct told me to move faster, to get out of the woods. The distant sounds were growing closer, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following me. The feeling of being watched, of something just out of sight, but always there. Every step I took felt like a step deeper into danger. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I reached the point where the trail widened, where the trees began to thin out again. I was almost back to the main path. My breath came in ragged gasps, and my legs were aching, but I couldn't stop now. I pushed through the last stretch of forest, finally stepping onto the well-worn trail that led back to the parking area. I didn't stop to look back. I didn't care what was out there in the woods. All I knew was that I had made it back, and I wasn't about to waste a second more in that place. As I reached my car, I threw my pack into the back seat, slamming the door behind me. The engine roared to life, and I sped off, not once glancing in the rearview mirror. That night, I couldn't sleep. My mind kept replaying the trail, the strange cairn, the markings on the trees. I still couldn't shake the feeling that something had been out there, watching me. I'd been alone on that trail, but I couldn't shake the thought that I had never truly been alone. I set out early in the morning, the sun barely rising, with the air crisp and cool against my skin. The trail was quiet, the kind of silence that settles over the land when it's still too early for the world to wake up. Birds weren't chirping yet, and the only sound was the soft crunch of the leaves under my boots as I walked. I've hiked a lot in my time, and I'm no stranger to the woods. But today, for some reason, something felt different. It wasn't that the trail was unfamiliar. In fact, I'd hiked this exact path a handful of times before. But today there was a sense of unease that I couldn't shake off. Maybe it was the stillness of the forest or the way the trees seemed just a bit closer than usual, their thick branches forming a canopy above, blocking out the early morning light. I shook off the feeling and continued on, focusing on my steps and breathing. The path was narrow, winding through thick patches of underbrush, with the occasional break where sunlight pierced through the canopy and warmed the ground. There wasn't a single cloud in the sky, and the weather was perfect for a hike. Not too hot, not too cold, just right. As I went deeper into the woods, the sounds of the world outside faded away, and the forest enveloped me. I was used to this feeling, this quiet isolation. It was almost peaceful, despite the nagging sensation that I was being watched. I told myself it was just nerves, nothing more than my mind playing tricks on me. After about an hour of hiking, I reached a small creek. The water was clear, trickling over rocks and forming little ripples that broke the otherwise smooth surface. I stopped to drink from my water bottle and decided to take a short break. I sat on a large boulder beside the creek, enjoying the solitude. I scanned the area, noticing how dense the forest was around me. The trees were old, their bark thick and weathered. The ground was damp, covered in moss and fallen leaves that crunched underfoot. There was no sign of any animals. No squirrels, no birds, not even the occasional rustle of something in the underbrush. It was as if everything had gone quiet. The wind picked up slightly, rustling the leaves in the trees. For a moment, I thought I saw movement in the corner of my eye. I turned, but there was nothing there, just more trees and shadows. I sighed, telling myself again that it was just my imagination. I had hiked this trail many times, and nothing had ever happened. I was safe and there was nothing to worry about. But as I gathered my things to leave the creek, I noticed something strange, something that didn't belong. Lying on the ground next to the water was a torn, weathered piece of clothing, a jacket or maybe a coat. It was hard to tell in the dim light filtering through the trees. The fabric was old and stained, like it had been there for a long time. I bent down to examine it, and that's when I noticed something even more unsettling: footprints. The prints were fresh. They weren't deep, but they were definitely there, imprinted in the soft ground by the edge of the creek. They were irregular, as if someone had been walking in a hurry, but they didn't seem to lead anywhere. They just stopped at the edge of the water, disappearing into the thick underbrush. My heart rate quickened, and I stood up, glancing around. I felt a sudden rush of unease, a tension in the air that hadn't been there before. My breath seemed to catch in my chest, and for a moment, I wondered if I was overreacting. After all, this was just a hiking trail. People come out here all the time. Maybe someone else had been here before me. I shook my head and tried to push the feeling away. I wasn't a paranoid person. I had hiked alone plenty of times, and nothing had ever happened before. There was no reason to believe anything would happen now. But despite my best efforts to stay calm, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I decided to press on, hoping that the unease would fade as I got further into the woods. I followed the creek for a while, making my way around boulders and over fallen logs. The path was narrow and twisted, and the trees grew thicker around me, blocking out more of the light. The air grew heavier, and the quietness of the forest seemed to press in on me from all sides. As I walked, I couldn't help but feel like I was being watched again. It wasn't just the sense of unease I'd felt earlier. It was something more tangible. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone standing just out of sight, hiding among the trees. But when I looked, there was nothing there. Only the endless expanse of forest stretching out in every direction. I pushed on, my pace quickening, eager to get through this section of the trail and find some sort of open space, something that would give me a sense of security. But the woods seemed to stretch on forever, the path winding endlessly, with no signs of life or any other hikers. Hours passed, or at least it felt like hours. My legs were starting to ache from the constant uneven terrain, and I was beginning to feel the weight of my pack pressing down on my shoulders. I knew I should turn back, but something in me urged me to keep going. It was as if the forest was pulling me deeper, urging me to continue. That's when I saw it. Ahead of me, the trail suddenly split into two. One path continued straight, winding further into the forest. The other veered to the left, a narrow, overgrown trail that I didn't recognize. At first, I hesitated. I had always taken the main trail, the one that went straight. But something about the left path intrigued me. It was darker, more secluded, like it led somewhere hidden, somewhere unknown. I stood there for a long time, weighing my options. But in the end, curiosity got the better of me. I took the left path, pushing through the thick brush as I made my way forward. The further I went, the more isolated the trail became. The trees grew taller and closer together, blocking out even more of the light. The air felt thick, almost suffocating, and the only sound was the soft crunch of leaves underfoot. My thoughts were swirling now, the unease from earlier returning with full force. I was regretting my decision to take this path, but it was too late to turn back now. Then, just as I was about to give up and head back, I saw it, clearing. It wasn't much, just a small patch of open ground, but it felt like a lifeline. I could see the sky above, and the sunlight was breaking through the trees, illuminating the area in a warm, golden light. It was peaceful, serene, the perfect place to rest for a bit. I stepped into the clearing, feeling the tension leave my body as I took a deep breath. For the first time in hours, I felt at ease. I sat down on a large rock, taking off my pack and stretching my legs. The quiet was almost comforting now, and I could hear the faint rustling of the trees in the breeze. But as I looked around, something caught my eye. Across the clearing, partially hidden by the trees, I noticed a shape. It was small, tucked away in the shadows, but it was definitely there. At first, I thought it was just another tree stump, but then I saw it move, just a slight shift, as if something was adjusting its position. My heart skipped a beat. I froze, my eyes locked on the shape. It was hard to make out details, but I could see the outline of someone, crouching in the shadows, barely visible against the tree line. I could feel my pulse pounding in my ears as I tried to make sense of what I was seeing. For what felt like an eternity, I sat there, unable to move, unsure of what to do. The figure didn't move again. It just sat there, watching me from the darkness. Then, as if some instinct took over, I grabbed my pack and stood up. My legs felt like they were made of lead, but I forced myself to move. I didn't look back. Couldn't. I started walking quickly, my footsteps barely making a sound on the soft earth. My mind was racing as I made my way back down the narrow path, retracing my steps. The forest seemed to close in around me, the shadows growing longer as the sun dipped lower in the sky. I didn't care how far I'd come or how lost I was. I just needed to get out. As I moved faster, my breath ragged, I realized that I wasn't hearing the usual sounds of the forest anymore. No birds, no rustling leaves, no insects. Just the sound of my own footsteps echoing in the stillness. I finally reached the fork in the trail, the one I had passed hours ago. I didn't hesitate this time. I took the right path, the familiar one, and I kept walking, my pace steady but desperate. It wasn't until I finally made it back to the main trail, with the first signs of the evening sky growing dark above me, that I allowed myself to stop and take a breath. My heart was still racing, my body aching from the tension, but I was out of the woods. I was safe. By the time I reached the parking lot where I had started the hike, the sun had set and the forest was completely dark. I looked over my shoulder one last time, half expecting to see someone, following me, but there was nothing. The woods were empty, and as I drove home, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had barely escaped something that I would never fully understand. But at least I had escaped. I never went back to that trail.